Judge Walter Ashcroft picked up the deed with 2 fingers, like it was something dirty, and held it up for the whole courtroom to see. "A black woman's word and some old paper," he said, smirking at Renata Coleman. "You really thought this was going to hold up in my courtroom?" He turned it over, scanning the yellowed page with theatrical disgust. 60 years old. Written in pencil. "You people always got a story like this, don't you? Land that just so happens to disappear the second somebody official asks for proof." Renata said nothing. He leaned toward the bailiff, loud enough for the gallery to hear. "Watch this. Let's see how far a fairy tale gets." He walked to the shredder bin beside his bench, dropped the deed in himself, and flipped the switch. The motor whined. 60 years of her grandmother's history curled into ribbons and disappeared. Nobody in that courtroom moved. Not the bailiff, not the clerk, not even Renata. She just watched, and she smiled. 5 minutes later, the same man who destroyed her family's history would be led out of that courtroom in handcuffs on his own bench, in his own robe. You don't want to miss how this ends. Drop where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I want to see this story land all over the country. And if stories like this move you, hit subscribe, because this one's just getting started. Marigold, Louisiana wasn't the kind of town that showed up on maps unless you knew to look for it. A scatter of houses along the bayou, a hardware store that had been there since 1962, and on the corner of Magnolia and 5th, a small bakery with a hand-painted sign that read Odessa's Kitchen. Renata Coleman had been running that bakery for 11 years. Before that, her mother had run it. Before that, it had just been a kitchen, the same kitchen in the same house her grandmother, Odessa Coleman, had bought outright in the spring of 1948. Odessa had been 42 years old that year, working 6 days a week as a housekeeper for a family in Baton Rouge, saving every dollar she could in a coffee can hidden under a floorboard. It took her 9 years to save enough. 9 years of scrubbing floors that weren't hers, cooking meals she'd never be invited to eat, so that one day she could stand on land, that was. She told Renata the story 100 times growing up, always the same way, always ending with the same line. "Don't nobody hand you nothing in this world, baby. You buy it, you keep it, and you fight for it when they try to take it back." Renata used to think that was just something old women said. She didn't understand it, not really, until the letter came. It arrived on a Tuesday in March, tucked between a water bill and a flyer for the spring fish fry. Cream-colored envelope, embossed logo, Sterling Development Group. Inside, a single typed page, polite in the way that only threats dressed up in legal language can be polite. Sterling Development Group is pleased to offer $340,000 for the parcel located at 118 Magnolia Street, currently held under the name Coleman. We believe this represents a fair and generous valuation given current market conditions in the Marigold area. Renata read it twice at the kitchen counter, flour still on her hands from the morning's bread. $340,000. The land 4 acres backing up to the bayou, with the house, the bakery, and the old pecan grove her grandmother had planted the same year she bought the place, was worth easily 3 times that, and everybody in Marigold with an internet connection and half a brain knew it. Sterling wasn't building condos on the coast 20 miles east. Marigold's whole stretch of waterfront had suddenly become prime resort development, according to the county paper, and Renata's 4 acres sat dead center of what Sterling wanted. She wrote back the same week. One line. "Not for sale. Thank you." She thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. 2 weeks later, her neighbor across the road, Mr. Otis Reams, stopped by the bakery for his usual coffee and let it slip, almost embarrassed, that a Sterling rep had come by his place too and offered him nearly double what his land was worth. No questions asked, cash up front, closing in 10 days. He'd sold within a week. Then the Hendricks family, 2 lots down, sold. Then old Miss Fay, who'd sworn up and down for 30 years she'd die on that land, packed up and left within a month, refusing to say why when Renata asked. By April, Renata's bakery sat on the only occupied parcel left on that stretch of Magnolia Street. Then the surveyors showed up. She hadn't called for a survey. Nobody in her family had. But one morning in early May, she came out to open the shop and found 2 men in orange vests driving stakes into her front yard, a tripod-mounted instrument aimed across her property line. "Can I help you?" she asked, standing in the doorway with her apron still on. "County survey," one of the men said, not looking up. "Boundary dispute filed." Filed by who? He finally glanced at her, shrugged. "Paperwork's downtown. Not my department, ma'am. Renata drove to the county clerk's office that same afternoon. What she found waiting for her wasn't a boundary dispute at all. It was a civil complaint, filed by Sterling Development Group, claiming that the deed on file for 118 Magnolia Street was defective, that the original 1948 transaction had never been properly recorded under state law, and that the parcel should therefore revert to the estate of the original seller, an estate that, conveniently, Sterling had already purchased the rights to. At the bottom of the complaint was a court date, 6 weeks out. Presiding judge, the Honorable Walter Ashcroft. Renata sat in her car in the courthouse parking lot for a long time after she read it, the engine off, the Louisiana heat pressing in through the windshield. She thought about her grandmother's coffee can under the floorboard. 9 years of scrubbing other people's floors. She thought, they can type up anything they want and call it paperwork. That doesn't make it true. But she also knew the way every black family in a town like Marigold knew, passed down like scripture, that in a courtroom, being right and being believed were two very different things. She went home that night and pulled the old cedar box down from the top of her closet, the one Odessa had left her, the one she'd never had a real reason to open all the way. Inside, the original 1948 deed, brittle and yellowed, her grandmother's careful signature at the bottom, a notarized bill of sale. Tax receipts going back decades, each one a small, stubborn proof that the Coleman family had paid for this land, year after year, without fail, without help, without anyone's permission. She laid them all out across her kitchen table, the same table Odessa used to roll dough on, and stared at them until the candle burned low. Somewhere in Baton Rouge, 30 miles east, Walter Ashcroft was having dinner with a man named Blake Sterling at a private club. Neither of them would ever mention in open court. Renata didn't know that yet. She only knew one thing for certain, sitting alone at her grandmother's table with 60 years of proof spread out in front of her. Whatever they were planning to do to her in that courtroom, she was not walking in unprepared. The Marigold Parish Courthouse smelled like every courthouse Renata had ever set foot in. Floor wax, old paper, and the particular staleness of a building where decisions got made about people's lives by men who never had to live with the consequences. She arrived 20 minutes early, wearing her one good Navy suit, carrying a folder of copies, never the originals. Not yet. Her cousin, who'd gone to paralegal school, had warned her never to hand over originals on a first appearance, and sat down at the defendant's table alone. Blake Sterling's attorney arrived at 9:05, trailing an associate and a rolling case of exhibit binders. His name was Gary Lindquist, a tall man with silver hair and a handshake he offered to everyone in the room except Renata. At 9:15, the bailiff called the room to order. All rise. The Honorable Walter Ashcroft presiding. Ashcroft entered without looking at anyone, robe swishing, reading glasses already perched on his nose as he thumbed through the case file like a man already bored with it. He was 61, silver-templed, with the kind of soft, well-fed face that photographed well at Rotary Club luncheons. Case number 24CV1187, the clerk read. Sterling Development Group versus the estate and occupants of 118 Magnolia Street. Ashcroft looked up, finally, and found Renata at the table. Miss Coleman, you're representing yourself? Yes, Your Honor. I couldn't secure counsel in time, but I'm prepared to— That's unfortunate, he said, not sounding sorry at all. He turned to Lindquist. Counselor, proceed. Lindquist stood, buttoned his jacket, and laid out Sterling's case in smooth, unhurried sentences. The 1948 transaction, he explained, had never been properly filed with the parish recorder's office within the statutory window required at the time. A clerical failure regrettable, certainly, but one that left the chain of title legally void. Sterling had since acquired rights to the original seller's estate and was simply asking the court to recognize what state law already required, that the property revert to its rightful chain of ownership. It was, Renata thought, a masterpiece of saying something monstrous in the calmest possible voice. When it was her turn, she stood and spoke plainly. Your Honor, I have the original deed, dated the 3rd of April 1948, signed by both parties and notarized by a Louisiana notary public. I have 61 years of consecutive property tax payments made by my family on this parcel, filed with this very parish. If the transaction had never been valid, the parish would never have collected 61 years of taxes on it. Ashcroft didn't even glance at the folder she raised. 60 years of paying taxes on land doesn't prove you own it, Miss Coleman. Plenty of people pay taxes on property they have no legal claim to. That's not evidence. That's habit. A few chuckles rippled from somewhere behind Lindquist's table. Renata felt her jaw tighten but kept her voice level. With respect, Your Honor, I'd like the court to review the deed itself before ruling on anything. I'll review whatever gets properly filed, Ashcroft said, already flipping to the next page in his folder. And I'll note for the record I've seen a lot of these old family deeds come through my courtroom over the years. Handwritten, half-faded, signatures nobody can verify anymore. Convenient, how they always surface right when somebody wants to keep land they can't otherwise justify holding on to. The words landed exactly where they were meant to. Renata heard Denise Okafor's voice in her head, her friend, the local reporter, who'd warned her weeks ago. He's done this before. Ask around. Nobody talks about it, but he's done this before. She hadn't understood then. She was starting to. Your Honor, she said carefully, I have the original document with me today, if the court would like to examine it directly rather than a copy. That got his attention, the first real flicker of interest he'd shown all morning. Bring it forward. Every instinct in Renata's body told her not to. Her cousin's voice, her grandmother's voice, some deeper instinct, she couldn't name all of it, screamed the same warning. But refusing a direct order from the bench, in front of a room full of Sterling's people, would look exactly like what Ashcroft wanted it to look like. A woman with nothing to hide behind but excuses. She walked to the clerk's desk, opened the cedar box, and lifted out the original 1,948 deed, the paper Odessa had folded into her Bible for 60 years. The paper that had survived 2 hurricanes, a house fire in 1979, and every hard winter in between, and placed it in Ashcroft's outstretched hand. He held it for a long moment, studied it, or pretended to. The courtroom was silent except for the tick of the wall clock above the flag. This, he finally said, is exactly what I'm talking about. Renata felt cold, settle low in her stomach. Your Honor? Ashcroft set the deed down on his bench and looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time all morning with an expression that wasn't quite a smile. We'll adjourn for the day, he said. I want all evidence resubmitted properly at the next hearing. Originals only. No copies. He rapped the gavel once. Court's adjourned. Renata stood frozen for a moment, watching him gather his papers, her deed still sitting on the corner of his bench, unreturned. Your Honor, she said. My document. He glanced at it like he'd forgotten it was there. You'll get it back at the next hearing, Miss Coleman. It's evidence now. It stays with the court. He was already walking toward his chambers before she could respond. Lindquist gave her a small, polite nod on his way out. The kind of nod a man gives right before he beats you at something he never thought you had a chance at winning. Renata sat back down at the empty defendant's table, staring at the space where her grandmother's deed had been sitting 30 seconds ago, and felt, for the first time since the letter arrived in March, truly afraid. Because if a man like Ashcroft could keep her original deed locked in his chambers between now and the next hearing, there was no telling what she'd be walking back into. The bakery's flour delivery didn't come that Thursday. Renata called the distributor in Lafayette, the same one Odessa's kitchen had used for 11 years, and got a voicemail box that never called back. When she finally reached someone 3 days later, the woman on the phone sounded uncomfortable, apologetic in a way that told Renata everything before she even finished the sentence. We're restructuring some of our smaller accounts right now, Miss Coleman. I'm real sorry. Nothing personal. It was personal. Everything about the last 2 months had been personal, dressed up as procedure. By the following week, her egg supplier, a local farm she'd bought from since she opened, also regretfully informed her they could no longer fulfill her standing order. Her landlord for the bakery's storage unit, 2 blocks over, sent a letter citing a change in business needs. One by one, the small threads holding Odessa's kitchen together were being quietly, deliberately cut. Renata wasn't naive. She knew what was happening. She just couldn't prove it. And proving it wasn't really the point anyway. The point was making her tired enough, scared enough, broke enough that walking away from the fight would start to look like the only reasonable choice left. She was standing behind the counter one evening, going over what remained of her supplier list with a red pen, when the bell over the door rang and Denise Okafor walked in, laptop bag over one shoulder, 2 coffees in hand. You look like you haven't slept, Denise said, setting 1 cup down in front of her. I haven't. Denise pulled up a stool. She was younger than Renata, 31, a reporter for the Marigold Parish Gazette who'd been trying for 2 years to get a real investigative piece past her editor and out of the county fair recap ghetto she'd been assigned to since she started. She'd covered the surveyor's story back in May, a small item, 4 paragraphs, buried on page 6. It was how she and Renata had first started talking. "I've been digging," Denise said, lowering her voice, even though the shop was empty. "Since your last hearing, I went back through parish court records, public filings, nothing hacked, nothing illegal. I promise you that. And Ashcroft's presided over at least 6 property disputes in the last 8 years involving black families with land going back 3 generations or more. All 6 ruled against the family. All 6 properties ended up, within a year or two, in the hands of development groups." She slid a printed page across the counter. 3 of those 6 sales trace back to companies with the same registered agent as Sterling Development. Renata stared at the page, the names blurring slightly. Same registered agent? Same law office in Baton Rouge files the paperwork for all of them. Different shell names, same handwriting, basically. Denise tapped the page. "I'm not saying I can prove bribery. Not yet. That takes bank records, wire transfers, something nobody's going to hand a small-town reporter voluntarily. But I'm saying this isn't your first rodeo with this man, and it isn't going to look like a coincidence to anybody who bothers to look." Renata sat with that for a long moment. Outside, the evening traffic on Magnolia was quiet. Just a few cars passing the empty lots where the Hendricks place and Miss Fay's house used to stand. "He kept my grandmother's deed," she finally said. "The original. Locked it in his chambers. Told me I'd get it back at the next hearing." Denise's face went still in a way Renata hadn't seen before. "Renata, you need to hear this from somebody who isn't your friend giving you a pep talk. You need to hear it as a warning. If that man is capable of what I think he's capable of, and he's got the original, the only original of the one document that proves your family's claim." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. "You think he's going to destroy it?" Renata said quietly. "I think a man who's done this 5 or 6 times already knows exactly how much easier this gets if there's no deed left to argue about." Renata felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her. The particular vertigo of realizing a fear she'd been trying not to look at directly was actually staring back at her. "Then what do I do? I can't get it back before the hearing. He as good as told me that himself." Denise reached into her bag and pulled out a business card, slightly worn at the corners, the kind that had clearly been carried around and handed to people for years without much reason to use it. "Coleman and Reyes, Civil Rights Law, Baton Rouge, L.A. This was your grandmother's lawyer," Denise said. "Way back, the one who helped her file the original deed in '48 made sure it went through the parish clerk's office properly, even when half the clerks back then didn't want to process paperwork for black buyers. Firm's still around. Different generation running it now, but I called ahead. They remember the name Coleman." Renata turned the card over in her fingers. "Denise, I can't afford. You don't need money for this conversation. You need to say one thing to whoever answers that phone." Denise's voice dropped lower, more serious than Renata had ever heard it. "Tell them you think a sitting parish judge is preparing to destroy the only original copy of a 60-year-old deed in an active property dispute, and that you have reason to believe it's part of a pattern going back years." "Why? What's that going to do?" Denise looked at her steadily. "Because that's not just a bad ruling anymore, Renata. Destroying evidence in an active civil case, if it's tied to a documented pattern and there's money changing hands somewhere behind it, that's not a family court matter. That's federal." Renata sat very still, the business card warm between her fingers, the red pen forgotten on the counter beside her ruined supplier list. She thought about the coffee can under the floorboard. 9 years of scrubbing other people's floors, so that one day she could stand on land that was hers. She thought about the deed sitting somewhere in Walter Ashcroft's chambers right now, locked in a drawer, waiting for a hearing that was now only 12 days away. She picked up her phone and dialed the number on the card before she could talk herself out of it. It rang twice before a woman answered. "Coleman and Reyes." Renata took a breath. "My name is Renata Coleman," she said. "I think I need to talk to somebody about a judge." The final hearing was set for a Thursday morning, and Renata woke before dawn without an alarm. The way she always did before something important, the same way she used to wake before a wedding order was due, before a big Easter rush at the bakery, her body keeping time with what her mind hadn't fully admitted yet. She dressed in the navy suit again, the only one she owned, pressed the night before on the kitchen table. She didn't bring the cedar box. There was nothing left in it worth bringing, no original left to protect, only certified copies she'd filed with the parish archives weeks earlier, on the advice of a young associate attorney named Priya Chandrasekaran from Coleman and Reyes, who'd told her over the phone, in a voice far calmer than Renata felt at the time, "Bring the copies. Let him do whatever he's going to do with the original. That's not the evidence that matters anymore. Renata hadn't fully understood what that meant. She understood it better now. The courtroom was fuller than it had been at the first hearing word had gotten around Marigold, the way word always did in a town that size. And a dozen or so locals sat scattered through the gallery, along with Denise Okafor in the back row, laptop closed, phone resting in her lap at an angle Renata chose not to think too hard about. Judge Ashcroft entered at 9:15, unhurried as always, and took his seat without acknowledging anyone. He had the original deed in a manila folder in front of him. Renata could see the edge of the yellowed paper peeking out, and beside it, a small metal wastebasket had been placed near the corner of the bench that hadn't been there at the last hearing. Lindquist opened smoothly, recapping Sterling's position. The 1,948 transaction was legally void. The copies Miss Coleman had since filed were irrelevant reconstructions with no bearing on the original defect, and the court should rule accordingly to restore the parcel to its rightful chain of title. When it was Renata's turn, she rose and kept her voice steady. Your Honor, I'd like the record to reflect that certified copies of the original 1,948 deed, along with 61 years of tax filings, were submitted to the Marigold Parish Archive on— I've seen the copies, Ashcroft interrupted. Copies aren't originals, Miss Coleman. We discussed this. With respect, Your Honor, the original is currently in the court's possession, submitted at your own request at the previous hearing. Something shifted in Ashcroft's face, a tightening around the eyes, gone almost as fast as it appeared. He opened the manila folder, lifted the deed out with 2 fingers, and held it up for the courtroom, the same way a man might hold up something he'd found on the bottom of his shoe. A black woman's word and some old paper, he said. And the words landed in the room like a dropped glass. You really thought this was going to hold up in my courtroom? A ripple went through the gallery. Renata didn't move. He turned the deed over, scanning it with theatrical disgust. 60 years old, written in pencil in places. You people always got a story like this, don't you? Land that just so happens to disappear the second somebody official asks for proof. Renata said nothing. Beside her, she was aware of nothing but her own heartbeat, slow and deliberate, the way it got right before she pulled a finished loaf from the oven and knew, before even looking, that it had come out exactly right. Ashcroft leaned toward the bailiff, loud enough for the gallery to hear. Watch this. Let's see how far a fairy tale gets. He stood, walked the 3 steps to the small metal wastebasket that Renata now understood had been placed there for exactly this purpose, and dropped the deed inside. Then he reached beneath his desk and produced a lighter, small, silver, the kind that lived in a desk drawer for cigars. Nobody smoked in the building anymore, and flicked it once. Your Honor, Lindquist started, half rising, an unreadable flicker crossing his face that might have been alarm or might have simply been surprise that Ashcroft was doing this in the open, in front of witnesses, instead of quietly in chambers the way it had presumably worked the 5 times before. Ashcroft ignored him. He dropped the flame into the bin. The paper caught fast, 61 years of a family's proof curling black at the edges, orange light licking up in the small metal basin, a thin ribbon of smoke rising toward the ceiling fan. Nobody in the gallery moved. Nobody breathed. Denise's hand had gone very still on her closed laptop. Renata watched the smoke rise and felt, for one long, strange moment, her grandmother's voice as clearly as if Odessa were standing beside her at the defendant's table. Don't nobody hand you nothing in this world, baby. You buy it, you keep it, and you fight for it when they try to take it back. She hadn't handed him anything today that mattered. She'd understood that the moment Priya told her to leave the cedar box at home. Ashcroft sat back down, brushing invisible dust from his sleeve, and looked at Renata with something that wasn't quite triumph, closer to boredom, the look of a man finishing a chore he'd done many times before. Now, he said, without an original document, Miss Coleman, I don't see how this court can find in your Honor, Renata said. Her voice came out level, calm, almost gentle. It was the calmness that made Lindquist's head turn toward her sharply, the calmness that made even Ashcroft pause mid-sentence, some old animal instinct telling him something was wrong before his mind caught up. Do you know what you just did? She asked. Ashcroft's mouth opened some retort already forming, something dismissive, another line about fairy tales and old paper. But before he could speak, the double doors at the back of the courtroom opened. 2 men in dark suits walked in without hurry, without announcement, the kind of walk that belonged to people who had already decided how this room's next 5 minutes were going to go. Renata didn't turn around. She kept her eyes on Ashcroft's face and watched the color begin, very slowly, to drain out of it. To understand what walked through those doors, you had to go back 6 weeks to a phone call Renata Coleman almost didn't make, and a decision that had nothing to do with luck at all. The morning after Denise handed her that worn business card, Renata had sat in her car outside the bakery before opening, phone in her lap, and dialed the number for Coleman and Reyes. The woman who answered transferred her within a minute to Priya Chandrasekaran, a junior associate with a voice that was quiet but never once uncertain. "Tell me everything," Priya had said. "From the letter in March. Don't leave anything out, even the parts that seem small." Renata talked for 40 minutes. The offer letter. The neighbors selling one by one. The surveyors. The complaint claiming the 1,948 deed was defective. The first hearing, and Ashcroft taking her original into his chambers with a promise to return it that had felt, even as he said it, like a lie dressed up as procedure. When she finished, there was a pause on the line long enough that Renata thought the call had dropped. "Miss Coleman," Priya finally said, "I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you, because it matters more than anything that happens in that courtroom. Okay, do not bring that deed back to your next hearing. If Judge Ashcroft still has the original in his chambers, do not ask for it back before the hearing date, and do not let him hand it to you in a way that puts it back in your custody before that room is full of people. Why? Because right now, you're the only person who has any incentive to prove that document is genuine. If it disappears while it's in your possession, it's your word against a sitting judge's. If it disappears while it's in his possession in front of witnesses, on the record, that becomes something else entirely." Renata had gripped the steering wheel. "You think he's going to destroy it? I think a man who's done this before knows exactly what he's doing, and I think we let him do it in front of as many witnesses as we can arrange." That same week, Priya had walked Renata through the parish archive process, filing certified copies of the original deed, notarized and time-stamped, entered permanently into the public record, immune to anything that happened to the physical original afterward. It took 2 days and cost Renata nothing but the hours she couldn't really spare. But Priya hadn't stopped there. She'd made one more phone call, to a contact she'd worked with 2 years earlier, on an unrelated matter, a federal contact, the kind attorneys keep in a private folder for exactly this kind of situation. His name was Marcus Webb, FBI, Civil Rights Division, out of the New Orleans field office. And when Priya laid out what she suspected, a pattern of rulings against black landowning families, all tracing back to the same handful of shell companies, all presided over by the same parish judge, Webb had gone quiet in a way that told her she'd confirmed something his office already had open. "We've had eyes on Ashcroft for 14 months, Webb told her, though he wouldn't say much more than that over the phone. Bank records showing deposits that don't match his salary. A vacation property in Destin nobody can explain how he affords. What we've been missing is something clean, something on the record, in open court, that ties the pattern directly to an active case." "What would that look like?" Priya had asked. "It would look like him doing something he's clearly done before, in a room full of witnesses, on a case where we already know the money trail. Nobody could have scripted what Ashcroft would actually do. Nobody needed to." Priya's advice to Renata had been simple, almost anticlimactic in how little it asked of her. File your copies quietly, don't fight to keep the original in your hands, and show up to that final hearing prepared to watch, not to argue. If he does what we think he's going to do, Priya had told her the night before the hearing, on their last phone call, "You don't need to say much. You barely need to react. Just let it happen, and let the room see it happen." What Renata hadn't known, what even Priya hadn't been entirely certain of until 2 days before the hearing, was that Marcus Webb had quietly requested, through a court order Ashcroft himself had never seen, access to the Marigold Parish Courthouse's own internal security footage. Cameras installed 18 months earlier for an unrelated insurance requirement, mounted in the corner of every courtroom, recording continuously, feeding into a server nobody in the building thought twice about. Ashcroft had built his career on the assumption that what happened in his courtroom stayed in his courtroom, that his word, his robe, his gavel were the only record that mattered. He had never once considered that the building itself might be watching him. 2 federal agents had been parked outside the courthouse since 8:30 that morning, waiting on a signal from inside. Denise Okafor's phone, resting at an angle in her lap through the entire hearing, hadn't been idle a single text, sent the moment Ashcroft reached for the lighter. One word, prearranged 2 days earlier with Priya. Now. Which was why, less than 90 seconds after the flame touched paper, the double doors at the back of courtroom 3 opened, and Marcus Webb walked in without hurry, a folder under one arm, his badge already out and open in his palm. Renata hadn't known the exact moment it would happen. She'd only known, sitting at that defendant's table with her grandmother's voice in her ears, that whatever Ashcroft did next, she would not be walking into that fire alone. The two men crossed the courtroom floor, footsteps echoing off the old wood, and stopped directly in front of the bench. "Judge Ashcroft," Webb said, voice even, almost polite. "I'm Special Agent Marcus Webb, FBI. I need you to step down from the bench, sir." For a long moment, Walter Ashcroft simply stared at the badge in Marcus Webb's outstretched hand, as if the object itself might rearrange into something less inconvenient if he looked at it long enough. "This is my courtroom," he finally said, and his voice came out thinner than he meant it to. "You don't have the authority to." "I have a federal warrant, Your Honor." Webb's tone never rose. It didn't need to. "Issued this morning, based on evidence gathered over the past 14 months, and confirmed by what this courtroom's own security system just recorded 30 seconds ago." Ashcroft's eyes flicked to the corner of the room, to the small black dome mounted near the ceiling that he had walked past nearly every working day for 6 years without once considering what it saw. That footage isn't admiss. It will be," Webb said, "along with the deed fragments still smoldering in that trash bin, which my colleague is about to photograph and bag as evidence before anyone touches it." The second agent, a younger man Renata hadn't caught the name of, was already moving toward the small metal wastebasket, snapping photographs before carefully lifting out what remained blackened curls of paper, a corner here, a scrap of Renata Coleman's careful signature there, still faintly legible against the char. Gary Lindquist had gone very still at the plaintiff's table, his hand frozen halfway to the legal pad in front of him. Renata watched something move behind his eyes, the particular, silent arithmetic of a man realizing the ground beneath his entire case had just opened up. "Your Honor," Webb continued, and there was something almost formal in the way he said it now, a title being used for the last time. "I'm going to need you to step down and come with us. You'll be given the opportunity to contact counsel." "On what charges?" Ashcroft said, though the fight had already started leaving his voice. "Destruction of evidence in an active civil proceeding, obstruction of justice, and honest services fraud, pending further review of financial records tied to a pattern of rulings this office has been investigating since last spring." Webb paused. "We'll discuss the rest downtown." Ashcroft's hand, resting on the edge of his bench, had begun to tremble, not dramatically, just a small, involuntary shake he seemed to notice himself, and tried, unsuccessfully, to still by gripping the wood harder. This is an active case," he said, to no one in particular now, to the room, to the gallery full of Marigold residents who had gone utterly silent, to the flag standing limp in the corner. "I have a docket. You had a docket," Webb said quietly. "This proceeding is suspended pending review by a different judge. Nothing that happens in this room today, from the moment you struck that lighter, is going to stand." It was Lindquist, finally, who found his voice, rising halfway from his seat. "Agent Webb, is it my client, Sterling Development, has no knowledge of any—" "We'll be following up with Sterling Development separately, Counselor. I'd recommend you sit down." Lindquist sat. Renata hadn't moved from the defendant's table this entire time. She sat with her hands folded in front of her, the way she used to sit as a girl in church while the sermon ran long, watching the scene unfold with a stillness that surprised even her. Ashcroft turned toward her, then the first time he'd looked directly at her since he'd dropped the deed in the bin, and for one raw second, something passed across his face that looked almost like a question. "Why didn't you fight harder to stop me? Why did you just watch?" She understood, in that second, that he had never once considered the possibility that her calm wasn't defeat. That the whole time he'd been performing his little theater of contempt for the gallery, she had already known exactly how this was going to end and had simply been waiting for the room to catch up to what she'd known for weeks. "You asked me a question a minute ago," she said, and her voice, when it finally came, was steady in a way that filled the silent courtroom completely. "Whether I understood what I just watched you do." Ashcroft said nothing. "I did," Renata said. "I understood it the moment you reached for that lighter. I understood it better than you did, actually, because I already knew that deed you just burned wasn't the only copy in existence. I filed a certified copy with the parish archive 6 weeks ago. I've had a federal agent's phone number in my contacts for a month, and everyone in this room just watched you destroy 61 years of my family's history on camera, out loud while explaining exactly why you thought a black woman's proof didn't count. A murmur moved through the gallery, not loud, but present. The sound of a room exhaling something it had been holding since the moment the lighter flicked. Webb placed a hand lightly on Ashcroft's shoulder, an unmistakable signal. Judge Ashcroft. Now, Ashcroft rose from the bench on unsteady legs, the same bench he'd sat behind for 6 years, dispensing judgments that had quietly erased families like the Colemans, one ruling at a time, and for the first time, the black robe he wore looked less like a symbol of authority and more like something borrowed that had suddenly, irreversibly, stopped fitting him. The bailiff, uncertain, moved to escort him, and Webb's colleague produced a pair of handcuffs from beneath his jacket. The metallic click, when it came, was almost gentle, nothing like the theatrical scrape of the shredder motor from Renata's first hearing, nothing like the hiss of the lighter catching paper, just a small, final sound in a suddenly very quiet room. Denise Okafor, in the back row, had her phone raised now, recording openly, no longer bothering to hide it. And Renata Coleman sat at the defendant's table where she had been sitting the entire time, watching the man who had burned her grandmother's deed in front of a packed courtroom get led out of his own courthouse in handcuffs, and felt, for the first time in 6 months, something in her chest finally begin to loosen. The courtroom didn't empty after Ashcroft was let out. If anything, more people crowded inward, traveling fast down Magnolia Street the way it always did in Marigold, until the gallery benches were full and people stood 2 deep along the back wall. A visiting judge from the neighboring parish, a soft-spoken woman named Judge Carol Beaumont, arrived within the hour to take over the docket temporarily. She reviewed the situation with the kind of careful, deliberate attention Ashcroft had never once shown Renata, reading through Priya Chandrasekaran's emergency filing line by line before looking up. "Miss Coleman," she said, "I understand you have a certified copy of the original 1948 deed on file with the parish archive." "Yes, Your Honor. Filed 6 weeks ago. Notarized and time-stamped. I'll want that entered into the record today, along with the tax filings you mentioned in your original testimony." While the clerk retrieved the certified copy, Marcus Webb requested a brief recess to present what his office had gathered, not as a formal part of Renata's property case, but as context the court, in his words, deserved to see before ruling on anything else that happened in this room today. What followed took the better part of an hour, and by the end of it, the anger that had been building in that courtroom for 6 months finally had somewhere to go. Webb laid out, methodically, what 14 months of investigation had uncovered. Bank records showing a series of deposits into an account belonging to Walter Ashcroft's brother-in-law, deposits that traced back, through 3 shell transfers, to Sterling Development Group, a vacation property in Destin, Florida, purchased 2 years earlier in the name of a trust Ashcroft's wife controlled, paid for in a lump sum that didn't correspond to either of their salaries. And a pattern, going back 8 years, of property disputes involving black landowning families, 6 cases in total, every single one ruled against the family, every single one ending, within a year or two, with the land in the hands of a development company tracing back to the same Baton Rouge law office that had filed Sterling's complaint against Renata. 6 families, Webb said, reading names into the record. The Delacroix family, 2016. The Fontenot estate, 2019. The Broussard land, 2021. He kept going. Renata recognized none of the names personally, but she felt something in her chest tighten with each one families she'd never met, losing what her own grandmother had spent 9 years scrubbing floors to protect, all because one man in a black robe had decided their proof didn't count either. Gary Lindquist sat very still through all of it, his silver hair suddenly looking less distinguished and more like a man trying to disappear into his own collar. When Judge Beaumont finally turned to him and asked whether Sterling Development wished to make a statement regarding their relationship with Judge Ashcroft, he stood slowly. "Your Honor, my client has instructed me to state, on the record, that Sterling Development Group had no knowledge of any improper conduct by Judge Ashcroft and that we intend to fully cooperate with any federal inquiry." It was, Renata thought, the sound of a company already rehearsing the story it would tell its shareholders by Monday morning. Judge Beaumont was not impressed. "Mr. Lindquist, your client filed a civil complaint 6 weeks ago claiming a 61-year-old deed was defective in a case that has now been directly connected to a documented pattern of similar filings against black landowning families in this parish, all decided by a judge whose bank records the FBI has just described in detail. I'll leave the question of Sterling's knowledge to Agent Webb's office. For now, I have a much simpler question in front of me. She turned to Renata. Miss Coleman, would you like to address the court regarding the property at 118 Magnolia Street? Renata stood. She hadn't planned a speech, hadn't let herself imagine, in the 6 months since the letter arrived, that she might actually reach a moment where someone in a robe was asking to hear her, not silence her. Your Honor, she said, my grandmother, Odessa Coleman, bought that land in 1948 with money she saved over 9 years, working as a housekeeper for a family that never once, in all that time, asked her name. She kept every tax receipt, every filing, every scrap of paper proving that land was hers, because she knew she told me many times that someone would try to take it back someday, and that the only defense she'd ever have was proof. She glanced toward the back of the courtroom, toward the burned fragments now sealed in an evidence bag on the clerk's desk. That man just proved her right, in the worst way possible, in front of this whole room. But he also proved something else. He proved that being calm isn't the same as having nothing. I didn't fight him for that piece of paper, because I already knew it wasn't the only proof that mattered. My grandmother taught me that 60 years ago, without ever once setting foot in a courtroom herself. The gallery was silent, but it wasn't the same silence as before, not the frozen, complicit silence of people watching an injustice unfold, but something closer to reverence. Judge Beaumont removed her glasses, set them on the bench, and looked at Renata for a long moment before speaking. Based on the certified copy entered into evidence today, along with 61 years of consecutive tax filings on record with this parish, this court finds that the deed to 118 Magnolia Street is valid and has been valid without interruption since April 3rd, 1948. She picked up her pen. Sterling Development's complaint is dismissed in full. Title to the property remains with the Coleman family. The gavel came down once a small, ordinary sound, nothing like the violence of the shredder motor or the hiss of the lighter, but it landed in Renata's chest like something enormous finally settling into place. The applause didn't start right away. It started the way rain starts a few scattered drops before the sky gives way completely. It began somewhere in the back row, where Denise Okafor stood with her phone still recording, tears running openly down her face, clapping even though her hands were shaking. Then Otis Reams, 3 rows up, who'd sold his land to Sterling out of fear months earlier and had shown up today only because he'd heard something was happening and couldn't stay away. Then a woman Renata didn't recognize, then another, until the sound filled the old courtroom from wall to wall, echoing off wood paneling that had, for 6 years, mostly heard silence and Ashcroft's gavel. Renata stood at the defendant's table and let it wash over her, unable, for a moment, to do anything but breathe. She thought of her grandmother. Odessa Coleman had never once, in her 91 years, set foot inside this courthouse as anything other than a bystander. She'd told Renata why. Dakin sitting on the porch of the house on Magnolia Street with a glass of sweet tea sweating in her hand, about a day in 1961 when she'd walked past this very building to pay her property taxes and been made to stand outside at a separate window in the August heat for 40 minutes, while white landowners were let in through the front door, out of the sun. I never went inside that place if I didn't have to, Odessa had said. Not because I was scared, because I didn't need their permission to know what was mine. Renata looked toward the tall windows at the side of the courtroom now, sunlight cutting through in long gold bars across the old floor, and for just a moment, she let herself imagine her grandmother standing outside those same windows 60-some years ago, patient, unbothered. Already certain in a way the world around her refused to be that the truth didn't need a courtroom's blessing to be true. It just needed time and someone willing to hold on to the proof long enough for the world to catch up. She would have liked this, Renata said quietly, to no one in particular, and found she was smiling and crying at the same time, an unfamiliar combination that felt, in this exact moment, like the only honest response available to her. Judge Beaumont let the applause run its course longer than strict courtroom decorum probably allowed, watching the room with an expression that suggested she understood exactly what this moment meant to the people in it and had decided the gavel could wait. When it finally quieted, she addressed the room one more time. I want to be clear about something, for the record and for everyone in this gallery today. What happened in this courtroom earlier, a judge destroying evidence, using his position to intimidate a citizen out of her rightful property, doing so along explicitly racial lines that is not, and has never been, Ordinary. It is not something any of you should have had to witness, and it is not something Miss Coleman should have had to survive. She looked directly at Renata. The fact that you did that, you prepared for it, that you had the composure to let the truth speak for itself, instead of losing yourself in a fight you'd already won before you walked in here, that took a kind of strength this court does not see often enough. Marcus Webb, standing near the back of the room now that Ashcroft had been taken out to a waiting vehicle, caught Renata's eye and gave her a small, respectful nod, the acknowledgement of one professional to another, though Renata had never once thought of herself as anything other than a baker fighting for her grandmother's land. Outside, on the courthouse steps, the crowd had grown larger, still word having spread through Marigold in the hour since the hearing began. Phones held up, a local news van from Baton Rouge already pulling into the parking lot, having caught wind of something happening at the Marigold Parish Courthouse that morning. Renata stood at the top of the steps for a moment, blinking in the sudden brightness. Denise beside her, Priya Chandrasekaran, having driven down the moment she got the call, still in her work clothes, hugging Renata so hard it nearly knocked the breath out of her. "You did it," Priya said. "You actually did it." "We did it," Renata corrected, though her voice caught on the word. Somewhere behind them, through the courthouse doors, Walter Ashcroft was being placed into the back of a federal vehicle, hands cuffed in front of him now instead of behind, head down, the black robe he'd worn into that courtroom that morning already replaced by a plain gray jacket someone had handed him. No cameras were let close enough to catch more than a distant, blurry image the local news would run it that evening regardless, the same 9 words playing on a loop across every regional broadcast by dinner time. A black woman's word and some old paper. They would become, within days, the 4 words that followed Walter Ashcroft everywhere he went for the rest of his life. Renata looked out over the crowd gathered on the courthouse lawn, neighbors, strangers, people who'd sold their own land out of fear and were now standing there with an expression somewhere between hope and disbelief, and felt the weight of 6 months settle, finally, into something she could set down. She thought of the pecan grove behind the bakery, still standing, still hers, planted the same year Odessa signed that deed. She thought about walking home tonight and telling her grandmother's story out loud, the way she used to only tell it in her own kitchen, because now, for the first time, the whole town finally understood exactly why it mattered. The federal indictment against Walter Ashcroft came down 11 weeks later. 4 counts of honest services fraud, 1 count of obstruction of justice, and 1 count of destruction of evidence in a federal civil rights matter after the Department of Justice formally absorbed the case once the pattern across 6 families became impossible to ignore. He pleaded not guilty at his arraignment, then changed that plea 9 months later, when the bank records Marcus Webb's office had spent 14 months assembling proved too complete to fight in front of a jury. He was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison, disbarred from the bench permanently, and stripped of the pension he'd spent 31 years building. Sterling Development Group didn't survive the fallout the way Blake Sterling probably assumed it would. Within a month of the hearing, 3 of the 6 families named in Webb's investigation filed civil suits of their own, represented, at Priya Chandrasekaran's insistence, by Coleman and Reyes on a contingency basis. The Delacroix family got their land back the following spring. The Fontenot estate settled for an amount large enough to buy back not just their original parcel, but the 2 adjoining lots Sterling had already sold off. Blake Sterling himself was never criminally charged. The money trail, Webb explained carefully to Renata over coffee one afternoon, had been built to protect him specifically, but the company's name became, within Louisiana real estate circles, a word nobody wanted attached to a deal anymore. Sterling Development quietly dissolved 18 months after that hearing, its remaining land holdings sold off piecemeal, most of them, eventually, back to the families they'd been taken from. Gary Lindquist resigned from Sterling's legal team within the week, and from private practice altogether within the year. Renata heard, secondhand, through Denise, that he'd taken a quiet position doing contract review for an insurance company 2 parishes over. Nobody in Marigold ever saw him again. Denise Okafor's coverage of the hearing, the footage she'd recorded that morning, combined with a 6-part investigative series she wrote over the following months, documenting all 6 families Ashcroft had ruled against, ran first in the Marigold Parish Gazette, then got picked up by a regional paper in Baton Rouge, then by outlets well beyond Louisiana entirely. The series won a state journalism award the following year. Denise dedicated it, in 3 lines at the top of her acceptance speech, to Odessa Coleman, who kept every receipt for 61 years, so that one day, someone would finally have to listen. Renata rebuilt what the last 2 months of that fight had cost her. The flour distributor in Lafayette called within a week of the ruling, offering to reinstate her account. She declined, and found a smaller, family-run mill 40 minutes north that she still uses today. The egg supplier came back too, apologetic. And this time, Renata said yes, not out of forgiveness exactly, but because the woman who ran that farm had 2 daughters, and Renata decided there was more use in teaching by example than in holding a grudge against people just trying to survive the same pressure she had. She renamed the bakery that fall. The old hand-painted sign Odessa's Kitchen came down carefully, its wood too weathered to save, and Renata commissioned a new one from a local woodworker. The letters carved deep this time, painted gold, mounted beneath a small brass plaque that read, Est, 1948, Coleman family land. She still makes the same bread her grandmother taught her, in the same kitchen, on the same 4 acres backing up to the bayou. The pecan grove Odessa planted the year she bought the land is 60-plus years old now, thick and heavy-branched, and every October Renata bakes pecan pies from what falls, sells them out the front window with a little card taped beside the register that tells the story, for anyone who asks, of a woman who saved for 9 years so her family would always have somewhere that was truly theirs. On quiet mornings, before the bakery opens, Renata sometimes walks out to stand under those trees with her coffee, looking back at the house, the sign, the land, all of it still standing, still hers, exactly the way her grandmother always said it would be if she just held on long enough for the truth to catch up. Some fights aren't won with raised voices or dramatic speeches. Sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is stay calm, keep the proof, and trust that the truth-patient, stubborn, unshakable, will eventually stand up in a room even when no one wants to believe it. Odessa Coleman never lived to see that courtroom, but she made sure her granddaughter never had to walk into it with empty hands. Has someone ever tried to erase what belongs to you, your history, your name, your truth? Tell me about it in the comments. I want to hear your story. And if this one moved you, hit subscribe, because there are more stories like Renata's still waiting to be told.